on the scene. He's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello everybody. As America wheezes and slouches its way to the November election, it's increasingly becoming a challenge to tell its story. It's a complicated story, it's an enormous story. Few people have the intellectual skills or the narrative ingenuity to do it, but one of the people who has done a much better job than most is my guest today, Arlie Russell Hochschild. She's been on the show a couple of times before. She's the author of the best-selling book Strangers in Their Own Land. She has a new book out. In some ways it's an analysis, a snapshot of America in November 2024. It's called Stolen Pride, Loss, Shame, and the Rise of the Right. And I'm talking to Arlie in her beautiful Berkeley home. Arlie, in this new book, Stolen Pride, are you trying to tell a certain story about America?
I'm trying to hear stories from people who have stories to tell but don't feel heard, and who generations back voted Democratic and now are voting Republican because they find that the Republican Party answers to their urgent questions about a decline in their lives. And that is, it's in a place called Eastern Kentucky. It is Kentucky 5, a congressional district that is the whitest and second poorest in the nation. It used to be Democrat, and now, the last two elections, it's been 80% for Donald Trump. And I went there to try and find why that political move.
One of the things I love about the book, Arlie, Stolen Pride, is that you build the narrative around an event, a march. Tell us about this march.
Yeah, well, you know, I got to Pike County in eastern Kentucky and realized that there was a perfect storm. Coal jobs were out, poverty was in, no new good jobs had come in, and a big opiate crisis had taken place. So here was a place in crisis. And then there was a neo-Nazi-led white power march, 2017, that came to Pikeville. And I thought, oh no, this is, you've got a lot of distress, you've got an appeal to a very scary solution to that set of real problems, and I'm going to stop and study every side of it. I'm going to interview the perpetrator, the protectors in town who wanted to avoid violence, the potential victims, blacks, and there was a Holocaust survivor and an imam at a small mosque, potential victims of the rhetoric coming to town. And then I wanted to interview top to bottom, side to side, the faces in the crowd to see how they would respond to this.
Arlie, you talk about interviewing. I think I do the interviewing rather aggressively in a very male way. My guess with you is, rather than interviewing, you're a champion listener, aren't you?
I love to hear stories. And I think it's really, I feel like I'm a treasure hunter and you hear these complex, interesting stories, people that pop out of the stereotypes every which way, and that is thrilling for me. I feel like I'm holding jewels in my hand. in a way, and that best happens when I try to take my own pride and shame off, take my alarm system off, so to speak, and really listen. So that's that's what I do. I love to do.
Yeah, you and I have talked before in previous interviews about the role of therapy in American political life. I'm not sure you necessarily want to think of yourself as a therapist, but certainly in America, which is scarce, the great scarcity seems to be trust. What you seem to have done in this book, Stolen Pride, is be trusted not just by leftists, critics of race, people who are hostile to Donald Trump and his minions, but also trusted on the right. How did you do that?
You know, I had a brother, late brother, who was a psychoanalyst, and I learned from him how, I loved how he listened to people, how he heard them with in a way, he was bilingual. He could hear rational talk, but he could hear emotions too. And in a certain way, I guess I have learned that from him and have tried to hear with his kind of hearing what is being said. And I guess what I really am doing in Stolen Pride is trying to help people on the Democratic side to hear, to become bilingual, so they can hear really the messages going back and forth between a charismatic leader, Donald Trump, who is appealing to them, I think through the language of emotion and especially pride and shame, to tune in so we know what they are hearing and why it would appeal. And unless we can do that, we're really talking to ourselves.
I tend to agree, and we may be jumping ahead, but I think the more progressives, the coastal elites shame Trump, the stronger his appeal perhaps in the hinterland. But that's maybe we can come to that a little bit later, Arlie. Yeah. Before we get there, what you learned, the message of the book, how did you decide to go to Kentucky? The march appeared, at least in theory, to be a replay of the Charlottesville neo-Nazi march. It didn't turn out like that. Did you decide to go to Kentucky before you knew of the march, or once you heard of it, did you choose to go to Kentucky and write this book?
I got there before the march, and by a fluke, I got a phone call one day, and at the other end of the phone was Ro Khanna, who was a Democratic senator from California, and he said, most of the people that I represent are in Silicon Valley, they're engineers, and they, many have immigrant backgrounds, as I do myself. They're people of color, as I am myself. But I crossed the aisle and made an arrangement with Hal Rogers, who is a Republican senator from eastern Kentucky, Paintsville, and who represents people who are not immigrants and not people of color, and not Silicon Valley. They're unemployed coal miners. And we got together. We crossed that political bridge to bring coding jobs to unemployed coal miners. Was I interested in looking at that? Yes, I was. And a few weeks later, I was in a plane and going to Louisville, Kentucky, where for a company called Interapt, there was a coding, 6-month coding training program for unemployed coal miners and generally underemployed people from eastern Kentucky. So as I kind of got these interviews with these students, I realized there was a whole world I didn't know about, and that's what got me into eastern Kentucky. And then I was looking around and heard about this march. That's how that happened. 2 of the people from that coding program followed me into the book.
Arlie, the movie director Alfred Hitchcock had a word to describe the march in your book, or at least its role in the narrative, a MacGuffin, in the sense that it seems to be the central feature of the narrative, but it actually turns out to be pretty irrelevant.
Yes, yes, exactly. In a way, I used it as a thermometer to take the temperature, political, moral temperature, cultural temperature of this community. And what I did was interview everybody. Interviewed the leader of the march, who was a neo-Nazi, whose last, and then I interviewed the city fathers who were trying to protect the community from violence, and then the potential victims. So, Holocaust survivor, an African-American civil servant, an imam that ran a small mosque in the area, and then all the faces in the crowd, top to bottom, side to side. The top was retired two-time Democratic governor who lived in the area, and two mayors and city officials. And the bottom were recovering addicts and felons who were in a prisoner release program. And side to side were Republicans and Democrats. So it was to get a rashomon, to see how one event looked from all these perspectives. You're right, it wasn't the event itself, which turned out to be a non-event.
Yeah, I threw out Hitchcock. You bring in Kurosawa's Rashomon, which saw a crime from very different perspectives, and by the end of the movie, you're not entirely sure exactly
what happened.
And I think that's one of the strengths of the book. Is there's no simple answer. I was waiting for the conclusion in the book, but there isn't one. It ends on other people's voices. You don't impose some sort of conclusion saying, well, this is what we learned from this experience. Well,
what we learned, what I hoped to be the conclusion, was a perspective. It's how to read politics, how to see. That's my conclusion, really, of it. If you pick up the book and you just think these are stupid people that have been hoodwinked by a con man, I understand that perspective. But if you put it down and see, those are not stupid people, those are people in a real pickle, and who were desperately looking for an out. And he's talking, and they are reading him in a language you don't yet speak, but now you do. That's what I intend, that you put it down, and now you're bilingual. Now you know how to read politics, because at the bottom of it, I believe politics taps into and exploits shame and pride. And it's as if politicians are miners looking for coal, and the coal that they're looking for is shame. So when we look at that, at politics in that way, and not just this politics, but if you read back pre-World War to Germany, and you look at all the situations pre-Civil War, you began to see that their emotions have been tapped and mobilized in certain ways. And that's the purpose of the book, is to alert us to that.
Yeah, it's a book not just about mining coal, but it also features coal miners. Arlie, you're a professor, a very distinguished professor of sociology. Some of your books have been more academic than this one. You're married to Adam Hochschild, very distinguished journalist, more of a popular writer than an academic writer like yourself. You really credit him at the end with helping you with your narrative. In terms of this MacGuffin of the march, what is the importance of storytelling in getting across a pretty sophisticated and ambitious intellectual idea?
You know, Adam has been enormously helpful to me. Very often he's saying, oh, no, don't don't spill all of these facts out in a list. You know, this is true, that's true, third thing's true, fourth thing's true. But tell it as a story. He's very good at that. He's helped me.
Yeah, you talk about, I'm quoting him, who's brilliant, acrobatic, red pen marked over multiple drafts. Do you do the same for him, for his books? Did he come to you with the need perhaps for a bit more intellectual substance?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. We help each other in different ways, but the drafts go back and forth. Our studies are right next to each other, and so each other's manuscripts are on each other's desks. It's one of the great pleasures and important gifts in my life.
Well, you and Adam are one of the great teams, I think, in American thought and literature, able to bring so many different skills, intellectual, academic, storytelling.
We have fun.
Well, you have fun, and I wouldn't say it's a fun book, but it's enormously readable, which is so different from so many of these types of books. I like the acknowledgement section in a book. It always tells you a lot about what the author's trying to do, and also the first quote. You have a quote from Wendell Berry, who also appears in the book, one of the great American environmental thinkers, and of course based in Kentucky. He features in the book, a minor character, but nonetheless significant. You quote Berry's Jayber Crow: "Telling a story is like reaching into a granary full of wheat and drawing out a handful. There is always more to tell that can be told." What didn't you tell in this story in Stolen Pride? What did you have to leave out that perhaps might form another volume or another book?
Yeah, I don't think I left out major things, but I did ask people, is there anything you don't want said? Just tell me, and it doesn't go out. The identity of one character, he was a felon in a addiction recovery program, and I don't give you his real name. So things like that, yeah, didn't go in.
One of the most memorable characters in the book is a neo-Nazi called Matthew Heimbach. I'm not sure if I pronounced that right. He seems to trust you enormously, and you tell his story. Tell us about this Heimbach, how you became trusted by him as you're the progressive sociologist from UC Berkeley who probably he throws darts at night. How did you manage to convince him to tell you his story?
You know, this isn't as hard as you would think. You would imagine this would be, he would just put a pie in your face. But if you say, look, I'm really interested in what brought you to believe what you do and do what you've done, will you sit down and talk to me? I'm writing a book. I'm a sociologist. Our beliefs don't coincide, but would you talk to me? Yes, he was happy to do it. Actually, wanted to tell his story. And it began with pride and shame in a way. He said, well, my father is German born and the name Heimbach, and I will not have German heritage shamed. You know, my mother comes from a Southern family and originally part of the Confederacy. I don't want her heritage shamed in a way. So I thought I was already learning something here. It was why that shield so instantly went up. And then much of his narrative was how he got the room in the house. He did not come from Appalachia, by the way. He came from Montgomery County, Maryland, and lived in what he called a McMansion in the basement floor where he put up Nazi flags and Mein Kampf, but my father never came down to look at it.
His father had no interest in it.
No interest.
Problem in many ways.
the father was very interested in heritage and went to visit cemeteries, but it was as if he would rather been there alone. As the story comes out. You know, the interesting thing, the paradoxical thing, is that Matthew Heimbach changed his mind. He later, in a series of interviews, he said, you know, I was really wrong to come into Pikeville and saying the white working class needs to be liberated. This is a white area. We built it. We should get the credit, the pride from it. He said, no, I should have really just spoken to the working class, black and white. So he kind of dropped this piece of his racism. Adam said, he said, oh, Arlie probably changed his mind. But that's not true. He had other reasons he changed his mind, and he didn't change all the way. But the paradox is that as the book recounts, this white nationalist march came to this struggling town, and the townspeople, spoiler here, kind of rejects his views, and he himself changes his views. Meanwhile, there was another march close by in town, that of Donald Trump. And many people weren't sure who Donald Trump was to begin with, but he increasingly embraced the far right and came to invite neo-Nazis to Mar-a-Lago. And he became closer and closer in views to Matthew Heimbach, and yet he was accepted. So we have two leaders, one who started extreme and was rejected and changed his mind, and then one who started a little more moderate and became extreme and was accepted. So I was interested in that crossing of wires.
And the Heimbach story is really incredible. I think at the end of the book he ends up working in a Jewish nursing home.
Yes.
Which is really astonishing. You couldn't make that one up, could you, Arlie?
No, and it ends with a woman who has dementia mistaking him for her nephew and loving him. Oh, thank you for coming. I am so happy to see you. Please give me a hug. And he is changing her and bathing her, and you know, in the all together, and sees her vulnerability, and he loves the work, and he thinks maybe I should try and get a nursing degree. At least I'm doing some good for the world, he tells me, and if I could get the money together, this could be what I do. You
just mentioned Heimbach and Trump together, sort of parallel ideological rivals, political rivals, although I don't think Trump would be too bothered with Heimbach. Both men have in common the fact that they seem to have been abused by their father. I know you've never had the opportunity to talk to Trump. I'm sure he would actually enjoy telling you his life story. Do you think in some ways, I mean, he was the son of a rich man, but do you think in many ways the loss and the shame and the stolen pride that you found in so many of these characters in the book, particularly Heimbach, you might find with someone like Trump?
Yes, I think it's a good guess. He had a very harsh father, hard to please. I don't think he's a reader, and he's very sensitive about shame. He will not be shamed, and it's not funny to be shamed. It's deeply serious. So I think he had a personal abuse injury and a special sensitivity to shame, but that gave him insight into what I would call a structural shame. A whole region goes down and is, because it's got an old-fashioned idea of pride, old-fashioned culture of pride, individualism, so if you go down, you're responsible for that failure. And so that is that connection between personal sensitivity and an ideology that appeals to a sensitivity and the pain of a structural shame, is that I'm trying to intercept. I think we need to be bilingual, we need to read emotions to see that when Trump seems to be off topic and just wandering around and orating, and it could be easy to say, oh, these people are silly, they're duped. No, something's going on that you're not listening for, and that it's at our peril. This is such a hugely consequential election before us. It's deadly serious. And so we have to look sharp. We have to get really good at reading all the messages that are going
it's not the reading, Arlie, it's the listening, as you say.
Yeah.
It requires a kind of bilingualism which you seem to have acquired, but very few others have it. Why?
It's learnable. It's not hard.
All you need to do is read Stalin Pride, right? Yeah. No, but in all seriousness, it's not that easy to acquire. You've acquired it over many years as a sociologist, as a writer, as a thinker.
I had an early experience that I think helped me with it. When I was 12, my dad had a job that took us to another country, and I felt plucked out of my ordinary life, and suddenly I was on the playground. This was in Israel.
Yeah, this is the Jerusalem chapter in Arlie's story. We interviewed you about it for Keen on America.
Yeah. And suddenly on a playground, you know, I didn't speak the language. I was a head taller than everybody. I had these funny Oxford shoes, dressed weirdly, tuned out. It was a very strict Scottish mission school. And I learned to be the other, to be not recognizable to others. And it was both painful and great. It really helped me be the stranger and have to reach out to others to make friends. And when I came back to the United States 2 years later, I didn't fit in there either.
Do you think, Arlie, it's an interesting narrative to understand the language of others, of strangers, and your first big hit was Strangers in the Other Land. One needs, in a sense, to become a stranger oneself, to have that experience you had as a 12-year-old in that playground in Jerusalem, and also in a way it separated you from your own family.
It did, and it was painful but useful. And then you realize we all, in a certain way, are strangers in our own lands, and that we could reach out to others who've experienced that themselves, all for different reasons. Ethnicity, social class, language, religion. That those differences feel smaller somehow when you're yourself more culturally mobile.
And it's funny that in the book, people's intolerance, particularly on the right, it's particularly triggered by others who journey radically, like transsexuals. Yeah. I wouldn't say, by the way, that the right is altogether more prejudiced than the left. No, I agree, but this is more of a book about the right than the left.
Oh, this is totally, about that, of course. You know, there was a man who was very upset about transsexuals. This seemed to bother him. And he was a MAGA Republican. And he said, you know, you have to know what's going on here. He said, my wife works with children with disabilities. She's a psychologist, and there are a lot of addicts women who are addicted, who have children, they have disabilities, and a high proportion of children are in foster care in this region because of addiction. There's poverty. Somehow the more educated and young are leaving, so that people here, there's a whole sense of being left, of being shamed. I mean, we're not the up-and-comers, we're who's left behind. And he said, with all of these problems, then you put transgenderism on top of that. It looks a little different than if you were to say, and I actually said to him, you know, what are we talking about, 1 or 2% of the population? And he didn't see it that way. He thought, oh, everything's fluid, everything's turned to, the social status system has become liquid, and we're going down. And other statuses with the identity politics of the Democratic Party are being lifted up, and we're going downstream. That was his feeling about it. And it gave me a different perspective. It wasn't this rigid kind of disapproval. It was more his sense of decline than some other sense of superiority. His prejudice was not from the top, it was kind of from a sinking bottom. Felt different. And he didn't feel it being addressed from a vantage point of being understood.
I'm rooted in the idealism, probably not particularly realistic, of the innocence of children. Arlie, in this electoral cycle, there's already been a couple of assassination attempts against Trump, more and more fear of violence. There was a lot of fear of violence around that march. The march itself was a bit of a damp squid, and it doesn't give away the narrative in the book. But violence forms a very important piece of your narrative. Many of the people you talk to had violent childhoods, violent relationships. They beat up their wives. Or their daughters were beaten up by their husbands. There's an atmosphere of violence hanging over this narrative. Is that an exaggeration, or is that true?
That's true. That's true. And there's violence from the kinds of the violence in the kinds of work people did. In other words, a lot of people died in the mines, and they got injured or crushed, and came out with black lung. And it was a kind of violence to be suddenly fired. It's a tough place to live, but also a sense that feuds were, the gun was close by. People believed.
In Kentucky, you play around with the classic, was it the West Virginia or the Kentucky blood feud between, what is it, the McCoys and the
Hatfields, yeah.
Which was, of course, a very violent one. Do you think, as a sociologist and in the narrative in Stolen Pride, is violence what happens when you run out of words, or is there something more central to the role of violence in these societies?
No, I think it's what happens when you run out of words and you run out of any desire to search for common ground. And actually, what's interesting, I analyzed actually that feud between the McCoys and the Hatfields, and it had an uncanny kind of similarity to the feud between the Democrats and the Republicans now. They felt like it began with the idea that something was stolen. It was the McCoys accused the Hatfields of stealing a pig, and some 20 or 30 people over decades lost their lives all about the stolen pig. Well, I compare that to this idea of a stolen election, stolen. And who is it that does the accusation? It is there is some kind of material decline. Turns out the McCoys lost a lawsuit that took land away from them that could be lumbered, and the Hatfields did better and began to actually hire as lumbermen the McCoys who were under them. There was a slippage in a status system, in a pride system. And so there was a material loss and a cultural loss of pride behind that small story of two kin groups that had a parallel to what's going on between the Democrats and Republicans today. So violence was there, but you know what precedes it, I think, is a whole story of pride and shame. And one central point to the book is that we're tuned out to it, but there is, I think, an offering Trump makes to his followers in the form of a pride shielding ritual that, if you're tuned into it, goes on weekly, monthly, in his rhetoric. When he seems to be wandering, what's actually happening, I think, is a 4-moment anti-shaming ritual. In moment 1, Donald Trump says something transgressive. He says, immigrants eat animals, pets, something like that. In moment 2, the punditry shames him. That's not a fact. How can you just talk about this and insist on the truth of something that's false? I mean, how can you do that? Punditry shames Donald Trump. That's moment 2. Moment 3, Donald Trump becomes the victim of the punditry's shaming. Oh, look how they're attacking me. Look, I'm the innocent one. It's so hard to be attacked and to be shamed. You know, you followers of mine, how difficult it is to be shamed by the public. So I'm taking the shame for you. I'm taking the hit. They really want to get you, but they're attacking me.
Yeah, I'll take it for you. I'll take the bullet.
I'll take the bullet for you. Look how proud I am, and I'm the victim. And then in moment 4, Donald Trump roars back at the shamers. So we have this 4-moment ritual, and I believe the Democratic side hears moment 1, the transgression, and 2, the shaming, and tunes out to the rest. But Republican side hears moment 3, Donald Trump is the victim, and 4, he roars back, especially 4. So it's a 4-part thing, but we listen to different parts of it. And I think the whole thing, and 3 and 4, are the important appeal he has for his followers.
It's a kind of dance. It almost could have been choreographed by Stravinsky, this violence of modernity. Are you suggesting in some ways, Arlie, I mean, you're a sociologist, you're not an anthropologist, although I've never quite understood the difference between anthropology and sociology. They kind of blur into each other. Are you suggesting really that the best way to make sense of the rise of the right, and particularly Trump, is in anthropological terms?
I think it helps. I think there's no mystery to it. You can encounter people in an open way, and that we need to do it. And there's a whole actual set of studies that indicate that people on the Democratic side are less good at listening. We're more, actually, we don't believe in being in bubbles, but we are more in urban educated bubbles. And that people, there was one study, Pew study, 2021, that found that liberal Democrats were more likely to cut off encounters with people after someone said something they didn't agree with than were conservative Republicans. And they're more likely to misestimate what the opposite side thinks than were conservatives trying to estimate what liberals think. So the poignant thing is that while the left is more likely to cut things off, the right really changes its mind only when you're kind of, or best, when you're kind of sitting opposite a person, you get a real feel for who they are. So the left is not doing what the right more requires to cross an empathy bridge.
And of course, the left talks about tolerance all the time. You did a lot of listening, a lot of other people's words, Arlie, in this book, and you've done it throughout your career. Is there two kinds of languages? Maybe there's more than two kinds of language, but the literal and the symbolic. It seems to me that another fundamental miscommunication between progressives and conservatives in this country, when it comes to something like the stolen election, is that one side is talking symbolically and the other literally. Did you find a difference in the use of language and narratives in this book, in many of the people you spoke to? I mean, you know the progressive left. You live in Berkeley, many of your friends, your husband, we're all part of the same world. But did you find a different use of words amongst the conservatives you spoke to in Kentucky?
Yes. I would say that the same words could be used in different ways and felt different in the mouths of different people. I asked the people I came to know in Kentucky a lot about the 2020 election. Was it stolen, and how could it have been stolen? Had you heard about some 80, 90 legal cases all lost? This election was not stolen. What was the evidence? And I could see, I'll give you one example. A small businessman who led the Eastern Kentucky Patriots vehicle parade in 2020. And he said, well, yes, there were these legal cases, but he sort of dismissed those as evidence. And when I said, well, I've talked to other people who think that actually the reason Trump lost was that the liberals got busy and got out the vote among young people in cities. And he laughed at that. Well, yeah, guess that's true. But then he went back to the stolen thing. And then and many of them kind of shrunk the evidence. I'm really interested in denial. And we have denial on both sides here. But on the right, and my focus was on the right here, denial took so many forms. One, he said, this man I was talking to said, well, you know, when there was that platform with a noose to hang Mike Pence, well, do you see that telephone booth out there, how small that is? Well, the platform was only that small, as if somehow symbolically this was a smaller matter to him. It was a smaller falsehood because the objects were small. Another man said, well, oh, yes, there was some roughing up on January 6th, but, you know, boys will just be boys. They were blowing off steam. You know how boys are. So there's kind of these miniaturizations of the evidence, and denial took that form.
And the subtitle of the book is Lost, Shame, and the Rise of the Right. is one of the reasons why many on the right, including Trump, claim that their election was stolen, was that there's too much shame in loss.
Yes, and they were in defense against it, that in a sense, holding on to a lie was more appealing to them than because of the pain of an ignored truth. An ignored truth was their declining life and a set of life circumstances.
The other thing that goes with violence in the book is addiction. Kentucky was one of the tragic heartlands of the opioid, or remains the opioid crisis. You talk about Purdue Pharma and its role in all this. How does addiction fit into the narrative?
There is a phrase that is coined by the author of the book, Diseases of Despair.
Yes, Case and Deaton, they've actually been on the show.
Yes, a wonderful book, which I cite in A Stolen Pride. And we have the faces of that diseases of despair. One of the characters, you could call him the hero of my book, had overdosed 4 times from heroin, and he was in recovery, and he, like many, had to kind of learn to feel his feelings again. He said to me, you know, when I first met him 7 years ago, he was homeless and just entered his recovery program. And he said, you know, I don't know how to feel my feelings. I feel like I'm 4 years old. And I began to think, actually, we all don't know how to feel our feelings. That's a very important thing to do. And that he was kind of starting from scratch in a very humbling way. And it led me to a theory, a new idea in this book, that bridge builders, people who are trying to reach out to people unlike themselves, there's some on the left, I try to be one, and there are many on the right who are trying to reach out as well. But that there are 2 kinds of, an upstairs and a downstairs, you would say, on this bridge. There are people with 2 different kinds of life logic, and my addict fits one of them. On the upper bridge, you have people who are, have done well, given what they aimed for in life, and they want to give back, and they reach out. The noblesse oblige bridge, that's the upper deck of the bridge. And there were people, I give an example of that. That's commonly what you think of for someone who is reaching out. But there's a bottom bridge too, where someone who actually falls down to the bottom, who disappoints themselves and lifts out and then reaches across to others who have had that journey as well. So, and both of them have a certain relationship to shame. The top tier doesn't have much shame. It's not a traumatic issue, being suddenly ashamed. So you step over it. But the bottom, like this young man who overdosed 4 times, he said, I'm not afraid of shame. I have been through it already. You can't shame me. And so he reached out from that vantage point. And the people who, the rest are sort of in the middle, but I think those are 2 kind of life circumstances that make it likely that you're interested in reaching out. So we need to identify and applaud those people.
Yeah, and it's not just drug addiction, alcohol addiction, and other forms of addiction. You note in the book, in your conversations, they're both a cause and an effect of addiction. And
Yes.
they get compounded. You have this vicious cycle.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So, and this one exemplary man who tells his whole story is an example. In 4 years, this man completely transformed himself. When I met him, he was, as I say, homeless and divorced and had lost much of his social life. And 4 years later, he had remarried. He was recovered from his addiction. He was working in a recovery center, helping others up from that despairing position. And he had just been asked to be the director of a whole recovery center. So you see the whole quite extraordinary young man on his feet, giving back. And ultimately, pride comes from the word to be of use, and to have an audience, a community that acknowledges what you can give and how useful you can be to the community. And there had been a loss of pride. This isn't just a material thing, but a loss of sense of being of use to your community and acknowledged.
Yeah, it's interesting that I think of the character you're talking about. His life was changed when he saw an ant carrying another dead ant. So clearly there are moments of great drama. And there is a lot of hope in the book. I mean, obviously it's a very dark book in some ways. It's a story of addiction, the radical right, neo-Nazism, violence. But it also seems to be a book, Arlie, and maybe this is what conservatives in America do very well. It's a book about love. I felt one of the most memorable couple of characters in the book were two young people,